You slid the pan to where the burner ran hottest and had supper moving before the news came on. Fatback spitting, cornmeal waiting, whatever the seller had about to become a meal. Nobody ever clocked it. They just knew. Here are 60 forgotten 10-minute hillbilly dinners for seniors living alone. Salt pork and milk gravy was the Christmas morning breakfast that fortified working families before a long day of visiting and celebration. Thick slices of salt-cured pork belly were fried slowly in cast iron until edges crisped and fat rendered into the pan. That rendered fat became gravy's foundation. Flour whisked in until golden, then milk added slowly while stirring until it thickened into creamy white sauce flecked with crispy pork bits. Poured over hot biscuits fresh from the oven, the combination delivered salt, fat, and satisfaction in every bite. Salt pork cost a fraction of bacon and could be preserved without refrigeration for months, making it essential for families living far from towns. The gravy stretched small amounts of meat to feed large families, each biscuit becoming a vessel for rich sauce. Children remembered this as the taste of Christmas morning, frying pork mingling with wood smoke and anticipation. Though rarely served today, salt pork gravy meant Christmas began with abundance. Cabbage and noodles, also known as haluski in some old neighborhoods, was a dish that filled plates and stomachs with almost nothing. It was a simple mix of butter-fried cabbage and boiled egg noodles, seasoned with salt, pepper, and maybe a little onion if you had it. That was it. But it stretched food farther than you would believe. Families leaned on this recipe when meat was scarce and grocery money ran out, and you would find it scribbled in Eastern European cookbooks or passed around mining towns and factory communities across the Rust Belt and Appalachia. It filled the kitchen with a warm, buttery smell, and it filled bellies with carbs and comfort. Some folks added bacon bits when they had extra. Others just kept it plain, but either way, this meal stuck to your ribs and made the hard days a little easier. It was never about flair. It was about feeding your family with dignity and scraping by on what you had. Cabbage and noodles proved you could eat well, even when your wallet said otherwise. Creamed chipped beef on toast was salty, rich, and unforgettable, not because it was fancy, but because it was served when nothing else was available. Soldiers knew it by another name, a name not polite enough to print in most cookbooks: stuff on a shingle. It was made from dried beef, often canned or jarred, sliced into strips and simmered in a thick white gravy made of flour, butter, and milk. That gravy was poured over slices of toast, sometimes stale, sometimes scorched, but always appreciated. The salty meat and creamy sauce combined into something that stuck to your ribs and warmed you up fast. After World War II, veterans brought the recipe home. It started showing up in diners, school cafeterias, and humble kitchens across the country. It was cheap, it was fast, and it turned scraps into something that could feed a whole table. Creamed chipped beef on toast was not just a dish. It was a reminder that sometimes survival looks like a plate scraped clean. Canned milk corn chowder was a soup that hugged you from the inside. You'd open a can of evaporated milk, pour it into a pot, add a few handfuls of frozen corn and some instant potato flakes, and let it all come together over a low flame. The result was thick, creamy, and comforting, the kind of meal that tasted richer than your wallet said it should. It warmed you up fast and made you feel like you had something special on the stove. This was a dinner for cold nights, small paychecks, and big appetites. Even without bacon or cream, it had depth, thanks to the sweet corn and that canned milk tang. Served with a few crackers or a slice of bread, it made a full meal out of almost nothing. Canned milk corn chowder wasn't just food. It was a reminder that with a pot, a can, and a little patience, you could turn scarcity into comfort. One of the next inventive things people came up with during really hard times was potato peel soup. This is about as bare bones as it sounds because it's really just seasoned water that's been made into a makeshift broth with potato peels in there. Despite this, let me tell you a little about why this is a pretty good dish. It's because it keeps you full for an incredible amount of time. Have you ever had oatmeal and felt incredibly full afterward? For like a surprisingly long amount of time? This is because oatmeal has a substantial amount of fiber in it, and potatoes are pretty much the same. Half their fiber content comes from the peel itself, actually. This is what makes potato peel soup such a good dish for when you don't really have any kind of money. It sustains you and really helps keep your appetite down, which is sad in retrospect because you have to be keeping your hunger down, but these days we have to do that pretty often. It helps to have dishes that are really good with fiber because they have this nice effect of you wanting less food, and thus you have more money at the end of the day. I think the most intimate food experience for anyone from the South is easily just hominy grits. Like, these are definitely a Southern ride or die as far as breakfast is considered. Creamy, loaded with corn and customizable in about 1,000 different ways, there's a lot that hominy grits bring to the table that other dishes just don't seem to compare to. And that too on a budget. They're made from hominy, which is essentially just dried corn that's been treated with an alkaline solution and then grounded into coarse grits. And when cooked slowly with water, milk, and broth, they actually turn into this incredibly thick, fantastic porridge that's worth its weight in gold. What makes hominy grits really stand out is their sheer versatility, though. I mean, the possibilities are quite literally endless. You can go the savory route or the super sweet route, and all you have to do is just add a bit more of whatever spices, seasonings, and herbs you're working with. Hominy grits are so effective largely because they were a Native American creation. The tribes were making hominy a long time before any Europeans set foot on American soil, and they helped to popularize the tradition, which is how it turned into a go-to for Southern kitchens by the 19th century. If you've ever opened a can of sardines, you know it has a distinct, strong flavor, one that isn't for everyone. But during the Great Depression, a canned sardine and mayo sandwich was a common lunch that stretched a tight budget. Sardines were affordable, packed with protein, and could sit on the shelf for ages. They weren't just easy to find, they were easy to store. The fish was mashed up with mayonnaise, often with a little bit of onion for extra bite, then slathered between slices of bread. Though the flavor might have been an acquired taste, it was a filling meal that kept hunger at bay. And with the mayo adding creaminess, it was surprisingly comforting. While sardines may not be the most glamorous fish, they certainly played an important role in feeding families during tough times. You might think this sandwich is a strange mix, but it's actually a great way to get protein when the pantry's running low. And while sardines gave you that fishy flavor, it was about to get a little more sweet and creamy with the next sandwich on our list. Tomato soup with grilled cheese croutons took a beloved classic and added a budget-friendly twist by using small cubes of toasted cheese sandwiches as a crunchy topping. The smooth, tangy tomato soup was often made from canned tomatoes or tomato paste, simmered with simple seasonings like onions and garlic to keep costs low. Adding grilled cheese croutons brought texture and extra flavor without requiring expensive ingredients. This dish was a staple in 1970s homes, offering warmth and comfort during cooler months without stretching the food budget. The croutons were typically made from leftover sandwiches, reducing waste while enhancing the soup. Together, the creamy soup and crispy cheese bites created a satisfying contrast that felt indulgent even when made with humble components. Tomato soup with grilled cheese croutons was a perfect example of turning pantry basics into something more memorable, making it a cherished meal for families of all sizes. Rice pudding with raisins turned leftover rice into Christmas dessert that felt far more special than ingredients suggested. When rice remained from previous meals, thrifty cooks transformed it by baking slowly with milk, eggs, sugar, and precious raisins saved for holiday baking. The pudding emerged from the oven golden and creamy, with plump raisins scattered throughout like treasure. Cinnamon and nutmeg added warmth that made the simple dish taste festive. Families served it warm or cold, sometimes with cream for those who could afford it. Children loved the sweetness and surprise of finding raisins in each bite, never realizing they were eating kitchen economy. The dish required no special equipment, just a baking dish and patience for slow cooking. Rice pudding represented the creative bridge between everyday leftovers and holiday celebration, proving that Christmas dessert did not require expensive ingredients, only knowledge of how to transform simple things into something worth remembering. Tomato custard casserole turned two everyday items, canned tomatoes and eggs, into a richly flavored dinner that captured the resourcefulness of the 1960s. The eggs were whisked with milk and a pinch of sugar before being poured over chopped tomatoes and breadcrumbs, then baked until the custard set and the top turned slightly caramelized. This casserole provided protein, vitamins, and comfort all in one dish without requiring expensive meats or elaborate preparation. Many families served it with buttered toast or a simple green salad, letting the natural acidity of the tomatoes balance the creamy custard. The recipe became a reliable weeknight option because it used inexpensive pantry staples that were always on hand. Its smooth texture and gentle sweetness made it appealing to children, while adults appreciated the subtle complexity that developed as the tomatoes baked. This unassuming casserole is a testament to how mid-century cooks could transform basic ingredients into something hearty, nourishing, and surprisingly elegant with little more than patience and a hot oven. Root cellar vegetables like turnips, carrots, and beets were the unsung heroes of survival. Pulled from the cold earth, scrubbed clean, and tucked away in dirt or sawdust, these vegetables could last for months. They didn't need fancy storage or refrigeration, just patience and a cool spot. When the snow came down and gardens were bare, the root cellar was where hope lived. Families would pull out a few turnips or beets and boil them into thick soups or mashed dishes. They were the backbone of winter eating, sturdy, dependable, and nourishing. The earthy scent of boiling vegetables filled homes with warmth even when the world outside froze over. Kids might have groaned at another bowl of turnip stew, but their parents knew it meant survival. Those root vegetables were like old friends, never glamorous, but always there when you needed them. Ketchup soup stew started out as a joke, but not the funny kind. When the tomatoes were gone and the cans were too expensive, families reached for what little sweetness they had left: packets, pumps, and sticky bottles of ketchup. 2 or 3 squirts, some boiling water, and a prayer. Add elbow noodles or rice if you had it. Maybe half an onion, chopped thin enough to melt. The ketchup colored the broth red, tricking the eye into believing it was tomato stew. It was not. But that was the trick. That was the magic. Your grandfather might have slurped it down and said, "Tastes just like Heinz." But no one was laughing. This was what you ate when the only store left was the diner's condiment counter. Sometimes a piece of bread got dunked in. Sometimes a cheese rind floated like a lifeboat. It was survival, disguised in red. And no one ever forgot the taste, not because it was good, but because it meant someone still tried to make a meal out of nothing. Peanut soup was a filling option that came straight out of the need for protein when meat was too expensive or unavailable. Ground peanuts simmered with water or milk created a creamy, nutty broth that was surprisingly hearty. Onions, celery, or a bit of leftover potato might be added to give it body, but the peanuts did most of the heavy lifting. The flavor was rich enough that it almost felt indulgent, even though it cost very little to prepare. Served with cornbread or biscuits if available, it could stretch into a complete meal for an entire family. Many households in the South relied on peanuts as a cheap crop, and this soup was a natural way to put them to use. For many children who grew up during the Depression, peanut soup became a nostalgic memory of warmth and survival, showing how simple ingredients could stand in for things they could not afford. Egg salad sandwiches were the soft answer to a hard life. You started with boiled eggs, cheap, filling, easy to store. You mashed them with a fork, added whatever mayonnaise you had, maybe a pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, sometimes even mustard if you were fancy. Then came the white bread, thin and fragile, sticking to the egg like it was doing you a favor. It was cold, quiet food. Not flashy, not warm, not especially comforting. But it filled the space between hunger and dinner. You ate it standing up over the sink or wrapped in wax paper at school. There was no crust if someone loved you. There was extra egg if someone loved you more. It was the lunch of the working poor, the dinner of those too tired to cook, and somehow it still managed to taste like home. The eggs were never just eggs. They were patience. They were leftovers. They were something made out of almost nothing. And when the fridge was empty except for a carton and a jar of mayonnaise, you knew what you were having. You did not choose it. You inherited it. Bread pudding with hard sauce transformed stale bread, something most families had in abundance, into Christmas dessert that rivaled anything from a bakery window. Day-old bread was torn into chunks, soaked in milk and eggs, sweetened with sugar or molasses, then spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg before baking until golden. The magic happened when hard sauce was poured over warm pudding, butter creamed with powdered sugar and flavored with vanilla or whiskey, melting into rivers of sweetness. Nothing was wasted. Bread that would otherwise go to chickens became celebration. Families added raisins or dried apples when available, stretching the dessert while adding bursts of sweetness. The pudding served as both dessert and breakfast the following day, continuing holiday spirit through Boxing Day. For working-class households, bread pudding proved Christmas didn't require expensive ingredients, just patience, creativity, and wisdom to transform ordinary pantry items into something extraordinary. Eggless depression. Cake with vinegar was one of those desserts that proved how far ingenuity could stretch when money ran out. With eggs, milk, and butter often too expensive or rationed, families still wanted a treat. Something sweet to lift the mood after hard days. Enter the vinegar cake. It sounds odd, but the vinegar reacted with baking soda to create a surprisingly fluffy, moist crumb without the need for eggs or dairy. You mixed simple pantry staples like flour, sugar, cocoa powder if you had it, and a splash of vinegar to make the batter. The result? A rich, chocolatey cake that showed up in community cookbooks and neighbor-to-neighbor recipes all across the country. Some folks called it wacky cake, others just called it survival baking. But it got the job done. You might not have frosting or fancy ingredients, but a warm slice of depression cake was enough to bring a little joy to the dinner table. In tough times, that simple, sweet bite meant more than anyone cared to admit. Cornmeal mush was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner, depending on how tight things were. Made from water, salt, and cornmeal stirred into a thick porridge, it was one of the oldest and most adaptable poor man meals. While hot, it was ladled into bowls and eaten with a little milk, molasses, or bacon drippings if you were lucky. Once cooled, it firmed into a solid loaf that could be sliced and fried in a skillet until golden brown. Fried cornmeal mush developed a crispy edge and a creamy center, making it a favorite among those who knew how to stretch a pantry. It was incredibly cheap to make. A single sack of cornmeal could feed a family for weeks. You would find it in southern homes, Midwest farms, and mountain cabins. Anywhere a hot, filling meal was needed without spending more than a few cents. Some paired it with beans, others topped it with syrup. It might not be on today's breakfast menus, but in those handwritten cookbooks, it remains a quiet legend. Proof that even the simplest grains could carry a family through. Butter and sugar sandwiches were the childhood candy of the broke and content. 2 slices of white bread, a spread of butter, and a sprinkle of sugar. That was dessert. Kids came home from school hungry, opened the pantry, and made these without asking. Sometimes the butter wasn't real butter, but margarine, slick and sweet just the same. It wasn't fancy, but when you bit into it, the crunch of sugar met the softness of bread in the most perfect way. It was cheap joy in the shape of a sandwich, a moment of sweetness when life was rough around the edges. Parents made them too, not just for kids, but for themselves, because a bite of that sugar and butter sandwich tasted like nostalgia. It reminded them that even when the world felt out of reach, they still had bread, sweetness, and a reason to smile. Hot cornbread is a historically significant variation of cornbread. Why? It's because it was so common in many disadvantaged communities in the South. Poor Black communities and even white communities in towns and rural outskirts from the 19th to the 20th century would try to get through the week just by lasting on this. As far as keeping it low-key is concerned, this minimalistic dish is definitely the way to go, and cornmeal, boiling water, and salt is all you need. It doesn't need eggs, milk, or wheat flour, it doesn't need any kind of oven, and it also doesn't really feel like a meal either. A small scoop of cornmeal was enough to make a lot of patties, yeah, but you needed a decent amount of sides to make sure it was actually a fulfilling dish, like beans, greens, and potatoes would help a lot. Also, in Black Southern communities, hot water cornbread was one of their core recipes. A real pillar of the community, And each different variation of cornbread was passed down from generation to generation, usually just by observation, word of mouth, or having someone drill the lesson into your head. Milk toast is also pretty much exactly what you think it is. Back in the old days, it was so much more common for people to take an intentionally frugal approach to how they spent their food, and especially the kind of hacks, snacks, and dishes they would come up with. All of these ideas were centered around being able to make the most using the least amount of time, energy, and ingredients possible. Milk toast is one of the best examples of that, because imagine if you tried to make the most out of some milk or some bread before it was about to hit those pearly gates and become fully expired. Yeah? You can't really figure out what to do, because while you'd normally just eat them on their own separately, this time that doesn't work. You just go ahead and get milk toast ready. The best part is that it works in 3 different ways. You get a nice healthy meal that's a pretty good breakfast or an interlude meal before your next big meal. You get to save money because you're not letting anything go to waste, nor are you buying something new because these ingredients are probably on their last legs, and you get a pretty lovely dessert out of it too. What's not to like, really? It's kind of insane how convenient milk toast can really be. The mashed potato sandwich is one of those unassuming comfort foods that became a staple for many families during hard times. When there wasn't much in the pantry, leftover mashed potatoes provided a quick and filling solution. The sandwich itself was simple. Just a hearty serving of mashed potatoes spread between 2 slices of bread. While it might sound basic, the potatoes brought both substance and satisfaction, especially when other food options were limited. The mashed potatoes could be enhanced with black pepper or a drizzle of gravy if you were lucky enough to have it, adding a little extra flavor to what was essentially a very simple dish. The real beauty of the mashed potato sandwich was its versatility. If you had no other ingredients, it could still make a fulfilling meal. It was also a great way to use up leftovers from a previous meal, turning a side dish into the main course. This sandwich wasn't about gourmet flavors or complex ingredients. It was about being resourceful and making the most out of what you had. For many, it was an affordable, easy way to stretch meals further, especially when money was tight. The mashed potato sandwich might not have been the most glamorous option, but it was a meal that served its purpose well. And while it might seem simple, the next sandwich on our list takes leftovers and transforms them into a surprisingly hearty option. Grits and beans was a classic Southern pairing that balanced affordable, easy-to-grow corn grits with protein-packed cooked beans, making it a popular meal among low-income families in the 1970s. The dish was hearty and filling, providing energy and nourishment with simple ingredients that could be bought in bulk or grown in home gardens. Grits, often cooked creamy or slightly coarse, offered a comforting base, while beans added texture and flavor with minimal cost. This combination was flexible and adaptable, with variations depending on local bean varieties and seasoning preferences. It was a go-to meal that could be made vegetarian or with bits of pork for added richness when budgets allowed. Grits and beans reflected a culinary tradition rooted in resourcefulness and community, making it a staple on Southern tables during times of financial struggle. Its warmth and simplicity made it more than just food. It was a reminder of home and resilience. Molasses cookies were the sweet tradition that survived when sugar became too expensive for Christmas baking. Blackstrap molasses cost less than refined sugar and was available at every country store, giving these cookies their dark color and robust flavor. The dough was mixed by hand in wooden bowls, combining flour, lard, or bacon drippings, eggs, and generous molasses until it formed a sticky, fragrant mass. Ginger, cinnamon, and cloves were added when available, transforming simple ingredients into something that tasted like the holidays. Cookies baked on greased pans until edges crisped and centers stayed soft, filling kitchens with spiced aroma children would remember for decades. Mothers made batches large enough to share with neighbors and to leave out for relatives. The dark sweetness hit the tongue differently than sugar, deeper, almost earthy, with mineral notes that tasted like comfort. Molasses cookies proved Christmas could still taste special, even when pennies stretched impossibly far. Cabbage and noodles, Pulaski if your grandma called it that, was a gift from the old country wrapped in poverty. You boiled egg noodles until they were soft, but not mush. You fried cabbage and onions in butter or oil until they collapsed into golden ribbons. Then you tossed it all together and prayed the flavor was enough. It was peasant food, proudly so. Born from resourcefulness, not recipes. Even when money vanished, this meal stayed dependable, like a friend who never left. It was not pretty, and it did not try to be. Just beige on beige with a hint of steam. But it filled the house with the kind of smell that made you feel like someone was taking care of you. Even if that someone was just you, doing your best. The dish had roots in Eastern Europe, but in American kitchens it became something else. An immigrant memory passed down through empty cupboards and tight budgets. You could eat a giant plate for under $1 and still feel like you ate something real. Because you did. Canned tomatoes were the red gold of the poor man's pantry. They were cheap to make, easy to store, and could rescue just about any meal. During summer, when gardens overflowed, families canned tomatoes in big batches, lining shelves with jars that glowed like sunset. By winter, those jars became survival itself. Soups, stews, gravies, even casseroles, all started with a jar of tomatoes. Their tangy sweetness made even the plainest food feel alive. A spoonful of tomato could stretch a small bit of meat across a whole family's dinner. It added color, warmth, and flavor to gray days and gray plates. More than anything, canned tomatoes symbolized preparation, doing the hard work now so you could eat later. Every pop of a jar lid was a victory, proof that someone had planned ahead. Hot dog and rice stew was not about meat. It was about the memory of meat. One single hot dog, sliced into 10 thin coins, fried just long enough to scent the air and tint the oil. Then came the rice, cheap and bottomless, absorbing whatever was left. A bit of celery if it had not gone rubbery. A carrot nub shaved into slivers. The trick was timing. Let the hot dog cook too long and it vanished. Too short and it stayed rubbery. But done just right, it fooled the tongue into thinking you were eating something hearty. The broth, if you can call it that, was barely more than salted water and grease. But it shimmered. And when it hit the table, steaming and pink around the edges, children smiled. It looked like dinner. It sounded like dinner. That one hot dog stretched like a miracle across 6 bowls. They never forgot it, not because it was delicious, but because it was enough. And sometimes, enough is all anyone is really hoping for. Rolled oat meatloaf was another way people made do when meat was a rare luxury during the Depression era. The idea was simple. Oats were cheap, filling, and easy to find, so they became the backbone of many loaves when ground beef was scarce. Housewives would combine rolled oats with onion, a little broth or tomato juice, and perhaps an egg if one could be spared, then bake it until firm. The oats took on the flavor of the few seasonings and drippings that were used, giving the illusion of meat even if very little was present. If there was any beef or pork to add, it stretched further thanks to the bulk of the oats. Served with gravy made from pan drippings or even a thin tomato sauce, it could feel hearty enough to pass for the real thing. Many families came to appreciate the flavor and comfort it provided, even without meat. Hot dogs and baked beans were the dinner of choice when you had 5 mouths and $1. This was not about taste. This was about calories. You dumped a can of beans into a pot, sliced up some hot dogs, and let the whole thing simmer until it bubbled like lava in a cartoon. The beans were sweet, sticky, and filled with brown sugar or molasses, depending on the brand or the sale. The hot dogs were sometimes boiled first, but usually not. They were cut into coins and stirred in like meat confetti. You served it with white bread, not because it matched, but because it was there. No plates necessary, just bowls and spoons and the quiet acceptance that this was dinner, again. For some kids, this meal was a treat. For others, it was a warning sign. You knew what kind of week it was by how often it showed up. Still, it filled you up, and that mattered. The salt hit your tongue and stayed there. Even now, you probably remember that smell. Sweet, smoky beans and sizzling hot dogs coming from a chipped pot on a rusty stove. Stewed dried fruit compote was the Christmas side dish that brought summer's sweetness to winter's darkest days. jewel-colored fruits swimming in spiced syrup. Families preserved summer fruit by drying it near wood stoves, creating stores of apples, peaches, apricots, and prunes lasting until spring. For Christmas, dried fruit was covered with water, sweetened with sugar or honey, and simmered with cinnamon and cloves until fruit plumped in fragrant syrup. The compote served as both side dish and dessert, spooned alongside roasted meat or poured over pound cake. Preparation required starting days ahead, allowing fruit to rehydrate and absorb spices. Children received small bowls as treats between meals, sticky sweet fruit providing rare sugar when sweets were precious. The compote represented planning and preservation. Families who thought ahead enjoyed sunshine's taste when snow covered the ground. This tradition connected Christmas to harvest months, reminding everyone that celebration required year-round preparation. Bread and milk supper bowls were as plain as it gets, but they filled empty stomachs when there was not much else to eat. You sliced up old bread, stale, leftover, or whatever you had, and soaked it in milk, sometimes with sugar or a little syrup if you were lucky. That was it. It sounds pitiful today, but back then, this humble bowl of soggy bread was a familiar supper for kids, working folks, and anyone scraping by. You could find it written in old church cookbooks or jotted down on recipe cards passed between neighbors. The bread softened in the milk, turning into something like a sweet, simple pudding. In hard times, this was comfort food that came from next to nothing. It was quick, filling, and made the most of scraps that might otherwise get tossed out. Some families called it poor man's cereal, and it showed up at breakfast, lunch, or dinner depending on what was left in the pantry. It was never anyone's first choice, but when times got tough, bread and milk bowls made sure no one went to bed hungry. Potato candy sounds like a contradiction, but for generations, it was one of the cheapest, sweetest treats you could make at home. It began with a single leftover mashed potato, just one. To that, home cooks added powdered sugar, a little at a time, until it turned into a stiff dough. That dough was rolled flat, spread with peanut butter, and then tightly rolled again like a jelly roll. Sliced into pinwheels, the result was rich, creamy, and almost fudge-like. No one could believe it started with a potato. It required no baking, no eggs, and no fancy ingredients, just sugar, peanut butter, and leftovers. In hard times, potato candy appeared at holiday tables, on Sunday dessert plates, and inside tin lunchboxes. It was especially popular in Appalachian kitchens, where thrift and creativity walked hand in hand. It looked like something you would find in a candy shop, but it came from the humblest of ingredients. Kids loved the sweetness, adults loved the nostalgia, and everyone loved that it cost next to nothing. Potato candy was not just dessert, it was proof that when sugar was scarce and spirits low, you could still roll up something sweet. Boiled hamburger gravy on bread was a working-class miracle that filled bellies and stretched a single pound of beef for days. Instead of frying the meat, folks would boil it in water until it crumbled into soft bits, then stir in flour and a little grease to make a thick, savory gravy. It wasn't pretty, but it smelled like home, and it soaked right through white bread like a promise. Some called it poor man's stew, others called it Tuesday dinner, but it was the same everywhere, simple, hearty, and cheap. It was the kind of meal you made when the fridge looked bare, yet somehow everyone left the table satisfied. The gravy clung to your fingers, the bread got soggy, and no one complained because it tasted like comfort. If you were lucky, you added pepper or onions, but even plain, it hit the spot. This was survival cooking that didn't apologize for itself, just warm, heavy food for long days and tired hearts. Boiled salt pork and beans are pretty much the same deal. Now, beans just happen to be man's best friend when the going gets rough. You have so many different kinds of them, and you can have twice as many different kinds of food with them. Stews, soups, or something as economical as this. Boiled salt pork and beans actually stems from the Depression era, and it was a way to stretch out meat rations when they were running low, which was usually always. This is more beans than pork, I'll admit, but either way, it's a protein power punch that you don't want to be missing from your diet. Boiled salt pork and beans are also some of the easiest kinds of plates of food you can make. You don't really need to do anything besides just take the salt pork and boil it, along with the beans, adding whatever seasonings, aromatics, and herbs you prefer. That's pretty much how a lot of people used it back then anyway, although we have the benefit of choosing much better cuts of meat than they did. Even with a dish like this, in the Depression era, people would essentially just wait until the butcher's shops were discarding their most unwanted parts of the animal, and that's what they would buy for as cheap of a price as they could bargain for. It was usually something most shops were happy to let go of for some chump change, but nowadays, even that's like half your rent. Tallow fried potatoes are the OG French fries. They're insanely flavorful. They have that beautiful golden sheen to them, and they're about as crispy as you would want the perfect batch of French fries to be. A lot of that color, vividness, and flavor comes from the fact that they're fried in rendered beef fat instead of vegetable oil. Now, back in the day, and I mean way before the 80s, fast food joints like McDonald's were actually using beef tallow in their fries as well. That was a big part of what gave them that original iconic flavor. Tallow helps potatoes achieve a savory flavor that they would never be able to get to on their own. Plus, this just isn't there today with the modern oils we have. The best part really was the exterior, because a simple first bite was about as close to nirvana as you could get. If you were eating these when you were borderline starving, then you were pretty much about to have the best food experience of your life. Tallow was the go-to frying fat for a lot of American diners and fast food kitchens, and it's just not hard to see why. Elvis Presley wasn't the only one who loved a peanut butter and bacon sandwich. The combo of crispy, salty bacon and creamy, rich peanut butter created a high-protein, energy-packed sandwich that was a favorite for anyone in need of a quick and filling meal. It's easy to see why this sandwich caught on. It balanced savory and sweet, crunchy and creamy. The bacon gave it that satisfying crunch, while the peanut butter added a smooth richness. It wasn't the healthiest option, but when you're working with a tight budget and even tighter food supplies, it was a treat that gave you the energy to keep going. Not only was this a cheap meal, but it was also indulgent in a way that made you forget about how hard times really were. The combination of these two ingredients might have seemed strange, but it worked, and it worked well. But if you're craving something a little lighter, something that came before the age of bacon and peanut butter, the next sandwich on our list might be just what you need. Vegetable frittata with leftover veggies was a protein-packed casserole that rescued forgotten vegetables from the fridge, turning them into a hearty, affordable meal. Eggs, beaten and poured over diced carrots, peppers, onions, or greens, were baked until firm, creating a simple yet nourishing dish. This recipe was ideal for 1970s families who needed to make the most out of every grocery trip, using what was on hand rather than buying new ingredients. The frittata was filling enough to serve as a main dish and portable enough to be eaten cold for lunches or picnics. Its flexibility made it popular. Any combination of leftover vegetables could be tossed in without worrying about exact measurements. Baking the dish allowed the eggs to bind everything together, creating a warm, comforting meal that was easy on the wallet. Vegetable frittata highlighted the thrift and creativity of cooking during tough economic times while remaining delicious and satisfying. Stuffed cabbage rolls appeared on Christmas tables across immigrant communities, stretching small amounts of meat into dishes that fed entire families. The technique came from Eastern European traditions, adapted to Depression realities where ground meat was a luxury used sparingly. Cabbage leaves were blanched until pliable, then wrapped around filling of rice, onion, and whatever meat scraps the family could afford. Sometimes just tablespoons stretched through an entire batch. The rolls simmered for hours in tomato sauce, the long cooking tenderizing everything and melding flavors together. By Christmas dinner, each roll became a complete package of protein, grain, and vegetable. The aroma of simmering cabbage and tomatoes filled homes, announcing to neighbors that holiday meal was being prepared. Stuffed cabbage taught the art of stretching resources without sacrificing satisfaction, connecting families to heritage while solving the problem of feeding many mouths with little money. Ripe mashed potatoes with hamburger gravy were the comforting, savory meal that made kids race to the table before the pot even left the stove. Mothers browned small amounts of ground meat, then stretched every drop of drippings into a rich gravy with flour, water, and simple seasoning. Poured over a mound of fluffy potatoes, the gravy turned an inexpensive side into a full meal. Kids loved how the potatoes soaked up the sauce, every bite warm and satisfying. It felt indulgent without being complicated or costly. Mothers appreciated how far a single pound of meat could go when used this way, feeding several people with ease. Kids begged for it because it tasted like the kind of comfort only home could offer. Mashed potatoes with hamburger gravy were proof that thrift could still taste like abundance. Molasses jugs were the sweetness in a bitter life. Cheap and long-lasting, molasses could turn the plainest meal into something special. You could drizzle it on cornbread, stir it into beans, or mix it with hot water for a makeshift tea. It had a deep, smoky sweetness that tasted like comfort itself. Poor families loved it because it was cheaper than sugar and lasted 10 times longer. A single jug could see a household through months of tight times. Kids dipped biscuits in it, farmers used it to sweeten their coffee, and mothers poured it into cakes when they wanted to feel fancy. That thick, dark syrup was more than food. It was memory in liquid form. When money was thin and cupboards nearly bare, molasses was the one indulgence you could still afford. It reminded people that joy could still exist in small, sticky spoonfuls. Evaporated milk and pea stew was what you made when fresh food was a rumor and the pantry was all cans. A tin of evaporated milk, thick, sticky, and faintly sweet, poured into a pot of boiling water with a drained can of peas. That was it. Maybe a spoon of lard, maybe a pinch of salt. The peas floated like green eyes in a pale, milky broth. It looked strange, it tasted stranger, but it was warm, and it filled you. That creamy texture fooled your stomach into thinking it had eaten more. The peas, soft and briny, reminded you that vegetables once grew in the ground. Your grandfather probably ate this during the war, your grandmother during the ration years. It was survival sealed in tin and disguised as comfort. Evaporated milk and pea stew did not taste like hope, but it tasted like trying. And in times like those, trying was the greatest gift anyone could offer. Corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. Cream-chipped beef on toast was the kind of meal that did not ask for approval. It just showed up. Soldiers had it in mess halls, factory workers had it on break. And if you grew up poor, you probably stared at that milky white sauce clinging to thin strips of salty beef, wondering why it always tasted like desperation with a pinch of comfort. The dish was nicknamed SOS, and no, that did not stand for Save Our Souls, though maybe it should have. It was stuff on a shingle, if you want the cleaned-up version. A slice of toast, barely toasted, because who was wasting electricity on that? Then came the sauce, a flour-thickened mix of butter, milk, and cheap dried beef. Sometimes not even real beef, just salty mystery meat that tried its best. It hit the plate with a wet slap, and you ate it not because you wanted to, but because it was there. Because there was nothing else. It was World War leftovers cooked for peacetime kitchens, and it filled you up, whether you liked it or not. Today, it lives mostly in memory and old military cookbooks. But for those who ate it every week, it is not something you forget. You never really forget what it feels like to scrape the last bit of sauce off your plate with a slice of bread you wish was thicker. Crackling cornbread brought the taste of hog-killing season directly to the Christmas table. Golden, crispy bread studded with rendered pork cracklings that added richness to every bite. When families butchered their yearly hog in late fall, skin and fat were rendered down, leaving behind crispy bits called cracklings that were stirred into cornbread batter. The bread baked in cast-iron skillets preheated with lard until smoking hot, creating a crust that shattered between teeth. Cracklings provided bursts of salty, porky flavor throughout, turning simple cornmeal into something approaching luxury. This bread accompanied every Christmas dish, sopping up pot liquor from greens, crumbling into bean soup, or eaten alone with butter and sorghum. For rural families who raised hogs, crackling cornbread represented full-circle self-sufficiency. Nothing from the pig went to waste. The bread kept for days and could be reheated to restore crispness. Though rarely made today, crackling cornbread once announced Christmas had arrived. Ketchup and butter spaghetti was a meal born out of pure necessity, and a little stubbornness to keep pasta night alive even when tomatoes and meat were out of reach. During lean years, especially the Depression and rationing days, pantry staples like spaghetti became the backbone of dinner, but traditional sauce? That was a luxury. Folks got creative. You boiled your pasta, tossed it with a pat of butter, and squeezed on some ketchup to make an instant tangy sauce. It was salty, sweet, and just enough to trick your brain into thinking you had a proper plate of spaghetti. Kids loved it because it tasted familiar, and parents leaned on it because it was cheap and filling. This recipe showed up in countless old cookbooks and handwritten family notes, a reminder of how folks stretched every meal when they had to. It might not win awards for authenticity, but ketchup and butter spaghetti was survival food that kept families fed, and sometimes it even showed up when money got better, just because people never forgot its place at the table. Tomato gravy and biscuits sounds unusual today, but in the rural South, it was once a go-to breakfast for those with more tomatoes than money. Canned or fresh tomatoes were simmered with flour, fat, and milk to create a creamy, tangy sauce that was poured generously over hot biscuits. If you had bacon grease, you used it. If not, butter or lard worked fine. The gravy was thick, pinkish, and full of flavor, a bright, hearty start to the day when sausage or eggs were out of reach. Some people added sugar. Others kept it sharp and savory. It was born from necessity but stayed because it was delicious. Old cookbooks passed the recipe down with pride, often scribbled in pencil with side notes like, "Add more pepper if Papa's home." For many families, tomato gravy and biscuits were not just a meal. They were the taste of early mornings on a porch swing, of hot kitchens and clattering pans. It filled you up and left just enough for leftovers at lunch. And while it has nearly disappeared from modern menus, those who remember it know, few things stick to your ribs, or your memory, like tomato gravy made from scratch. Fried saltines were the unofficial snack of the broke, hungry, and resourceful. Crackers were cheap and always around, and all you needed was a skillet with a bit of oil. You'd toss in a handful of saltines, let them pop and crisp up, then dust them with salt or pepper, or sometimes just eat them plain and hot. The result was something so simple it almost felt like a secret. The crunch was addictive, the smell buttery even when no butter was used. People made them late at night after long shifts, when dinner had been a memory hours ago. Fried saltines made you feel like you were treating yourself, even though you were just stretching the last crumbs of the pantry. It was survival food disguised as a snack, and it kept more people fed than you'd think. Bread pudding with water sauce is about as simplistic as it comes. This is a dish that people didn't even really put any thought into. It was just a way for them to repurpose resources that were about to spoil and go to waste. This is really something you never want happening in the Depression because it was a sign that you were just not handling your pantry properly. Back then, people religiously followed a mindset of not wasting anything, even the grease and drippings from bacon, and you'll find a dish or two made out of that later on in this video too. Back to bread pudding with water sauce. So, you might have heard of bread pudding before, but what really is water sauce? I mean, it sounds like a bastardized version of sparkling water when you first hear it. It's actually just a modest attempt at making a thickened sauce out of just water, because most of the time people were not working with any kind of legitimate thickener or enough ingredients to make a proper sauce, so they had to settle for whatever they could come up with to make stale bread more refreshing. The bread pudding in question is essentially just stale, almost moldy bread soaked in sweetened water, and most of the time, the sweetening was with things like maple syrup. Even this is something people began to tap out of maple trees whenever they could because they couldn't spend the extra cents. Still, we have a lot more leverage nowadays, so you can probably actually make a decent bread pudding-based sauce dish with enough ingredients and guidance, but the next time you really need to finish some bread, you know what to make. Hot water fried cornmeal cakes are an old-school Southern staple that don't really get even half the love and attention they should these days. I just want you to visualize a crispy, golden brown cornmeal cake with the most incandescent exterior you've ever seen, and then a tender, soft center that just leaves you wanting more and more. But it's natural, and even good, to get curious. And when you hear hot water fried anything, your first instinct is to immediately go like, wait, what? And I really wouldn't blame you. The practice of making cornmeal cakes this way is something that actually goes back several centuries, right back to the enslaved African Americans in the South who were making the first versions of these. Without access to proper feed, not even leavening, they found a way to make do with just cornmeal and water, and these were also known by a much more popular name, hoe cakes. Now, in the end, they started to fall out of everyone's go-to cooking preferences, but I think cornmeal cakes have one more comeback in them, despite it all. The fried bologna and mustard sandwich is one of those classic comfort foods that speaks to simplicity and practicality. A true Southern favorite, this sandwich became a staple in many households during tough times when meat was scarce and budgets were tight. Bologna, a processed meat that was inexpensive and easy to find, was fried until it curled up, creating crispy, golden edges that added texture and flavor to the sandwich. The bologna's richness was perfectly complemented by a generous smear of mustard, which added a tangy zing that cut through the greasy richness of the fried meat. It wasn't a sophisticated meal, but it was satisfying, hearty, and filled you up without costing much. The best part was how easy it was to prepare. A quick fry on the stove and a spread of mustard, and you had yourself a meal in no time. The bologna was affordable and could be bought in bulk, making it a practical choice for families trying to stretch their food dollar. While it may not have been gourmet, the fried bologna and mustard sandwich provided a familiar, comforting taste that many still remember fondly today. It wasn't about fancy ingredients or elaborate cooking methods. It was about making something hearty and satisfying with what was available. And while this classic combo hits the spot, the next sandwich on our list takes another humble ingredient and turns it into something surprisingly delicious. Mock tuna salad made with mashed canned chickpeas gave families a vegetarian option that saved money while still feeling satisfying. By substituting expensive tuna with protein-packed chickpeas, people could whip up a creamy, flavorful salad using budget pantry staples like mayonnaise, celery, and a dash of mustard. This clever switch allowed folks to enjoy the familiar tang and texture of a tuna salad sandwich without reaching for costly canned fish. It was especially handy during the 1970s when canned goods were pantry mainstays and fresh ingredients were often hard to afford. The salad was versatile too, perfect served on bread, crackers, or simply eaten by the spoonful, making it a go-to for quick lunches or potluck dishes. The gentle, earthy flavor of the chickpeas paired well with the crunchy veggies, providing a satisfying bite every time. This dish stood as proof that a little creativity could turn humble ingredients into something special, and it brought smiles to many faces who craved something familiar but affordable. Bread pudding transformed stale loaves into Christmas dessert, rescuing what would otherwise become waste and turning it into celebration. Every crust, every heel, every slice gone too hard to eat was saved throughout December until Christmas Eve arrived. The dried bread was torn into chunks, soaked in whatever milk the family could afford, then mixed with eggs, sugar, and precious spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. Baked until golden in cast-iron pans handed down through generations, the pudding emerged transformed from kitchen scraps into something resembling abundance. Families drizzled molasses or made simple sauces from butter and sugar to top their portions. The texture was both tender and substantial, the sweetness balanced by honest bread flavor. Bread pudding taught children that nothing should be thrown away, that creativity could rescue the humblest ingredients. This dessert carried Christmas forward when fancy cakes and store-bought sweets were impossible dreams for struggling households. Hominy and bacon casserole offered hearty satisfaction with minimal ingredients, highlighting how resourcefulness defined many mid-century meals. Creamy canned hominy provided a naturally sweet base that absorbed the smoky flavor of crisp bacon bits sprinkled throughout. A light sauce of milk and butter bound everything together before baking, creating a dish with comforting richness despite its simplicity. Families often served it as a main course with a side of green vegetables or a slice of cornbread, making it a complete and inexpensive dinner. Hominy's long shelf life and low price made it a dependable pantry staple, while just a few strips of bacon added enough depth to please meat lovers without straining the budget. The casserole reheated beautifully, so leftovers were welcomed for quick lunches the next day. Its combination of smooth texture and smoky taste made it popular at potlucks and church gatherings where thrifty recipes were always appreciated. Hominy and bacon casserole remains a testament to how modest ingredients can deliver true comfort and memorable flavor when prepared with care and creativity. Dried saltfish was a poor man's meat, cheap, salty, and ready to last through any storm. Before refrigeration, this was how families near the coasts stayed fed all winter. Fishermen would pack the catch in layers of salt until the flesh turned firm and dry, locking in the flavor. Once you had it, all you needed was water and patience to bring it back to life. Rehydrated, fried, or stewed, it carried the taste of the sea and the grit of survival. Poor households found ways to stretch even a small piece into a full pot of chowder or beans. The smell might have been strong, but so was the satisfaction. Salt fish connected entire communities, from the docks of New England to the rural South, where people learned to turn scarcity into tradition. It was proof that with enough salt, skill, and determination, nothing had to go to waste. Boiled onion stew was the meal you made when there was almost nothing left to make a meal from. Just onions, maybe 2, maybe 1 if that was all you had, sliced into ribbons and dropped into boiling water. Salt, if you were lucky. Pepper, if someone had saved a pinch. The pot simmered until the onions went translucent, soft enough to spoon, thin enough to stretch. The broth was pale gold, sweet from the onion's surrender. That was dinner. Served with a hunk of bread, stale and tough, but still sacred. People dipped it, chewed slow, closed their eyes, and tried to imagine something richer. It was not filling. It was not thick, but it was hot, and that counted for something. For families whose stoves had grown quiet, this stew brought back the sound of boiling. It brought back the smell of onions in the air, faint though it was. You could feed 6 with 1 bulb if you tried hard enough. That was the magic, or the tragedy. Maybe both, but no one ever forgot the taste, because it tasted like resilience, like making something out of nearly nothing. And sometimes that had to be enough. Sloppy Joes were chaos in a bun. They were sweet, tangy, sticky, and somehow always managed to spill no matter how carefully you ate them. This was not just a school lunch special. It was dinner for anyone trying to make a pound of ground beef stretch to its limits. The sauce was ketchup, sugar, vinegar, and maybe a splash of Worcestershire, if your family had that kind of spice rack. You browned the meat, dumped in the sauce, stirred it until it bubbled, then plopped it on the cheapest hamburger buns you could find. The kind that disintegrated under pressure. If you were feeling fancy, maybe you toasted the buns. If you were feeling realistic, you just got paper towels ready. Sloppy Joes made no effort to be elegant. They were messy, loud, and comforting. The kind of meal that made a mess of your face and your plate, but you ate every bite because it tasted like sugar and salt and home. You ate fast because it would soak through the bread if you waited, and you never complained because this was one of the good ones, one of the rare meals that actually felt like a treat. Stewed apples with bread cubes was a dessert that stretched every bit of fruit to its fullest during the Depression. A few apples, sometimes bruised or close to spoiling, were peeled and stewed with sugar or molasses if available. To make the dish go further, stale bread cubes were added to soak up the syrupy juices. The result was a warm, comforting pudding-like dish that could serve several people with only a handful of apples. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg might be added when they could be spared, but even without them, the dish was sweet and filling. For many children, this was the closest thing to pie they would taste during those years. It turned waste into dessert and brought comfort at the end of long days. Even though it cost next to nothing, it felt like a treat worth remembering. Stewed apples with bread cubes showed how creativity kept hope alive. Fried salt herring was the Christmas Eve tradition brought by Scandinavian and Northern European immigrants who settled in working-class neighborhoods across America. Whole salt-preserved herring were soaked overnight to remove brine, then dredged in flour and fried in butter until skin crisped and flesh turned flaky. The fish was served with boiled potatoes and pickled beets, creating a meal both festive and affordable. Salt herring cost almost nothing. Preserved fish was working people's protein, available when fresh fish wasn't. The tradition connected families to old country customs where herring signified abundance for the coming year. Children grew up associating the distinctive aroma with Christmas anticipation. The meal required starting the night before, soaking fish while the household slept, making preparation part of the ritual. Though the tradition has faded as preserved fish disappeared from American tables, salt herring once meant Christmas had truly arrived for immigrant families. Oatmeal water. Gravy on biscuits might sound strange today, but it kept a lot of folks going when meat and milk were scarce. Imagine a world where sausage gravy was off the table, too pricey, too hard to come by, and you still needed something hot and hearty to pour over your biscuits. That is where oatmeal water gravy stepped in. You cooked up a thin mixture of oats, flour, and water until it thickened, added a pinch of salt or bacon grease if you had it, and poured it over fresh or leftover biscuits. It was humble, filling, and as budget-friendly as a meal could get. You would find recipes for it scribbled in the margins of old Depression-era cookbooks or passed around farming communities where every scrap of food mattered. The gravy stretched breakfast, filled you up, and made dry biscuits a little easier to swallow. It was never about taste. It was about survival. Families leaned on this meal when meat was a memory, and flour, oats, and water were all they had left. Looking back, it was a reminder that pride takes a back seat when your stomach is empty. Egg drop soup in farmhouse kitchens was nothing like the kind served in takeout boxes today. It started with homemade broth, often from chicken bones or vegetable scraps, and was gently simmered until fragrant. Then came the eggs. Fresh from the backyard coop, they were beaten and slowly poured into the hot broth, stirring as you poured to create thin ribbons of cooked egg. Some added a handful of chopped herbs. Others threw in leftover vegetables or a scoop of rice. But even in its plainest form, this soup was soothing, warming, and incredibly cheap. It required only 2 ingredients and could be made in under 10 minutes. It was often scribbled in the back pages of old recipe books. No measurements needed, just a note that read, broth, egg, stir slow. And in those 3 steps lived a kind of comfort that has quietly survived generations. Even now, it still tastes like home, like healing, like doing a lot with very little. Mayonnaise and tomato saltines were what passed for luxury when the lights were dim and the pantry looked bare. You'd take a sleeve of saltines, smear each one with a bit of mayonnaise, then press on a slice of tomato fresh from a neighbor's garden or the grocery discount bin, sprinkle a little salt, maybe pepper if you had it, and you were set. Folks called them poor man's canapés, but they tasted like victory after a long day. It was the kind of snack you made barefoot at the kitchen counter with a glass of sweet tea sweating beside you. Kids thought it looked strange, but always came back for another bite because it hit that perfect balance between creamy, salty, and sharp. You could find families across the South and Midwest doing the same thing late at night, catching reruns on television with a paper towel full of saltines in hand. There was no need for fine dining or silver spoons, just a little mayonnaise, a ripe tomato, and something cold to drink. It wasn't just a snack. It was a reminder that the simplest things could feel fancy when you needed them to. Dandelion and bacon grease salad is an example of how Depression-era and 20th century foraging can actually lead to some really innovative recipes. This is something that's rooted in rural Midwestern culture, and this salad makes use of whatever is available in the wilds that day. One of the most common things you would ever find in these wilds was dandelion greens. They grew wild in all kinds of environments, roadsides, fields, and yards, and they were a really prized thing for the people. Most folks believed it was a natural remedy for a lot of things because it was believed to help with things like indigestion, inflammation, and strengthening your immune system. In subsistence farming areas and coal country, it was very common for families to teach their kids how to forage dandelion greens. Remember how I told you about the way bacon grease is used in a lot of these dishes? Yeah, so after frying the bacon, a small amount of bacon grease would be preserved and it would be used to flavor any kind of bland or plain dish like beans and cornbread and give it a bit of a savory edge. The rendered fat was really helpful to people because it also meant they didn't exactly need that much oil. Johnny cakes with sorghum syrup are just straight-up comfort food from a time when breakfast was this familial thing everybody looked forward to, and when breakfast was entirely made from scratch. Johnny cakes are these rustic little cornmeal pancakes that are actually very no-nonsense. None of the fluff, flair, and aesthetic charm you would normally associate with pancakes. Do you know that super cozy vibe they give off? Just not there this time. Johnny cakes are coarse, they're not the eBay when it comes to presentation, and they actually have this very deep, toasty corn flavor that pairs almost a little too well with the smokiness and richness of sorghum syrup. You can either use this in a dipping cup or drizzle it on top, but let's be real, the dipping cup is sacred. Anything else is blasphemy. Johnny cakes also have something of a history that goes back all the way to the indigenous peoples. They were the first ones to teach colonists how you handle cornmeal and how you should cook with it, and they were made to mirror the effects of other popular survivalist Native American food, such as pemmican. Its main function was lasting on long journeys and providing you with a boost of energy to carry on with your travels. If you've never tried a raw onion sandwich, it's one of those meals that'll stick with you, for better or worse. Sliced raw onions, slathered with a bit of mustard or mayo, tucked between two slices of bread. It wasn't gourmet, but it was a working man's lunch that packed a punch. Onions were cheap, easy to store, and filled you up. The mustard or mayo added some tang and creaminess, but the star of the show was the onion. Not only was it a strong-flavored, inexpensive option, but it was also a great way to keep your hunger at bay until your next meal. Though its pungent scent often lingered long after the meal was finished, it didn't matter when food was scarce. For many families, raw onion sandwiches were a quick fix that provided the sustenance they needed to get through the day. But if you think this is as bold as it gets, just wait until you hear about the next sandwich. Pineapple meatballs were a popular 1970s dish that combined inexpensive ground meat with canned pineapple to add a sweet and tangy flavor, stretching limited protein further. The pineapple chunks softened the meatballs while infusing them with a unique twist that balanced savory and fruity notes. This recipe allowed families to enjoy a festive, flavorful meal without splurging on fancy ingredients. Typically baked or simmered in a simple sauce, these meatballs were served over rice or noodles, turning modest components into a filling dinner. The canned pineapple was often a pantry staple, prized for its long shelf life and ability to brighten up otherwise plain dishes. Pineapple meatballs became a fun and unexpected crowd pleaser at tables, embodying the spirit of 1970s home cooking where creativity met necessity. Its charm was in making the most of what was available while keeping meals exciting and tasty. Oatmeal pie emerged as the poor family's answer to pecan pie, substituting humble oats for nuts that had become impossibly expensive. The filling combined oats with corn syrup or molasses, eggs, butter, and vanilla, creating texture and sweetness remarkably similar to pecan pies wealthier families enjoyed. Baked until the top turned golden and slightly crunchy, while the interior stayed gooey, oatmeal pie delivered satisfaction, exceeding its modest cost. The recipe spread through communities where pecan trees did not grow and store-bought nuts were beyond family budgets. Women shared it at church gatherings, proud of solving the problem of making fancy pie without fancy ingredients. Children receiving a slice at Christmas dinner experienced the same joy as those eating the original. Oatmeal pie represented both practical necessity and culinary creativity, proving that substitution could produce something genuinely delicious and teaching families that holiday traditions could be maintained regardless of economic circumstances. Spam and eggs were the emergency dinner that never felt like one. Spam was the meat that came in a tiny rectangular can, and once you heard that suction sound as it slid out, you knew what was coming. You sliced it thick or thin, fried it in a pan until it crisped at the edges, and served it alongside scrambled eggs that may or may not have come from a powder. It was salty, greasy, and surprisingly good, if you grew up eating it, that is. Some people looked down on Spam, but when money was tight, Spam was a lifesaver. It had a long shelf life, required no refrigeration, and could be stretched across several meals. It showed up in casseroles, sandwiches, and stews, but next to eggs, it felt like breakfast for dinner, which somehow made everything okay. You would douse it in ketchup or hot sauce, whatever you had, and you would eat it at a small table with mismatched chairs and flickering lights and think, this could be worse, and it often was. Oats and rolled grains were the quiet champions of frugality. A tin of oats might not look like much, but it could feed a family for days. Porridge for breakfast, oat bread for supper, or even oats used to thicken a stew, it all came from the same humble tin. They were filling, affordable, and versatile, which made them a staple in every working-class pantry. Kids were sent to school with oat mush in their stomachs, warm and heavy enough to keep hunger away until dinner. Farmers mixed them with whatever sweeteners they had, molasses, syrup, or sugar, to make simple cookies or oat cakes. Oats didn't spoil easily either, which made them perfect for long winters. They were the quiet kind of comfort food, the kind that didn't brag but always delivered. Their scent alone, the smell of something to eat, was enough to keep spirits up. Bacon rind stew was the art of borrowing flavor without spending meat. When the bacon was gone, the rinds, the tough, fatty edges, were what remained. Saved in coffee tins or wrapped in wax paper, they waited until the next stew. Dropped into water, they softened slowly, releasing salt, smoke, and the ghost of pork. Onions came next, maybe beans, maybe potatoes if the root cellar had not gone bare. The rind never disappeared completely. It just grew tender enough to chew if you dared, or fish out if you were polite. But the flavor lingered. It made the whole pot taste like bacon, even if there was no bacon in it. That was the trick. That was the genius. You fed a family on what most would have thrown away. The broth turned rich and deep. It smelled like Sunday. It felt like home, even if your shoes were patched and your coat too thin. Bacon rind stew did not pretend to be anything fancy, but it warmed the hands. It silenced the table, and it reminded everyone eating it that poverty could be proud, too. Cucumber vinegar salad was a refreshing Depression-era side dish that added brightness to otherwise plain meals. Cucumbers were easy to grow in home gardens, and when combined with vinegar, water, and a pinch of sugar or salt, they became a simple but flavorful salad. Thinly sliced and chilled if possible, the cucumbers soaked up the tangy brine and provided crunch. For families living on beans, bread, and potatoes, this salad was a welcome change in texture and taste. It required almost no cooking, which was another benefit when fuel and time were scarce. Often served in large bowls at supper, it gave the sense of a fresh vegetable dish without requiring expensive ingredients. Sometimes onions or dill were added, but the core recipe was basic and thrifty. For many households, cucumber vinegar salad was a reminder that gardening and resourcefulness could provide something close to luxury in the hardest times. Macaroni and tomatoes were a Depression-era classic, simple, humble, and oddly satisfying. This was not pasta. It was just boiled elbow noodles drowning in stewed tomatoes, maybe with a spoonful of butter if you had it. Some families added sugar to cut the acidity. Others added salt and pepper and called it gourmet. Either way, it was a bowl of starch and acidity that somehow passed for dinner. You would eat it with a fork because spoons were for people who made soup. Macaroni and tomatoes made no apologies. It was what you threw together when the pantry had almost nothing but cans and carbs. It filled your stomach and quieted the kind of hunger that made your ribs ache. And sometimes, just sometimes, it tasted like home. The sauce stained your bowl orange and clung to the bottom like it wanted to stay. If you ever asked what was for dinner and got this, you knew things were tight. And you also knew not to complain, because no one had time for complaints. You just ate, chewed slow, and wondered how something so bland could feel so familiar. That is what makes it special. It was not delicious, it was dependable. Cornmeal mush with molasses was the Christmas breakfast sustaining families when even flour became too expensive. Hot porridge filling bellies and warming spirits. Coarse cornmeal was stirred slowly into boiling water, cooking until it thickened into smooth, golden mass clinging to the spoon. The key was patience. Rushing produced lumps, while slow stirring created silk. Served in deep bowls with thick ribbons of blackstrap molasses pooled on top, the mush provided carbohydrates and iron fueling celebration. Some families added milk when available, creating creamier texture children loved. Leftover mush was poured into pans to set overnight, then sliced and fried next morning until crispy outside and creamy within. This meant one pot of cornmeal provided both dinner and breakfast, ultimate economy. Molasses was cheaper than sugar and provided minerals refined sweetness couldn't match. Together, cornmeal and molasses represented survival cooking's foundation, ingredients so basic yet satisfying that families survived winter on little else. Cornmeal mush with syrup was a breakfast that could keep you going all day when the cupboard was looking pretty bare. It was simple, humble, and exactly the kind of meal that showed up in every old American cookbook during hard times. Cornmeal was cheap, shelf-stable, and filling, which made it perfect for families trying to stretch pennies as far as they could go. You just boiled the cornmeal with water or milk until it turned thick and soft like a porridge. Some folks fried it into slices once it cooled, but the fastest version was straight from the pot with syrup poured over the top. Molasses, sorghum, or whatever sweet syrup was available did the trick. It sounds plain, but this was survival food at its finest. It filled your belly and kept you from feeling hungry even when meat, eggs, and bread were out of reach. Parents fed it to their kids before school, farmers ate it before long days in the fields, and plenty of folks relied on it when paychecks dried up. Cornmeal mush with syrup was never glamorous, but it was dependable. And sometimes that was worth more than taste. Wilted lettuce salad sounds like a mistake, but in Depression-era kitchens, it was a delicacy born from ingenuity. When fresh garden greens began to turn or lose their crispness, nothing went to waste. Instead of tossing the leaves, cooks revived them with hot bacon grease poured directly over the bowl. That sizzle? That was the magic. The dressing was simple. Bacon drippings, a splash of vinegar, maybe a pinch of sugar and black pepper. The hot fat softened the greens instantly, wilting them into something tender and savory with just enough bite. Sometimes there were bits of crumbled bacon or sliced onions tossed in too. For many, the smell of vinegar hitting hot grease still brings back memories of crowded tables, patched-together meals, and the comfort of eating what was on hand. Wilted lettuce salad was not a compromise. It was a celebration of survival. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were the proud invention of leftovers and late nights. You'd open the fridge, see a bowl of yesterday's spaghetti, and realize that bread was the only thing left. So you'd scoop the cold noodles right onto the bread, fold it over, and take a bite. It was messy, chewy, and surprisingly satisfying. The sauce soaked into the bread, turning it into something that didn't need reheating or plating. It became a classic among factory workers, college kids, and tired parents who didn't have the energy to reheat a pan. It might have looked ridiculous, but it worked. It was dinner without dishes. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were proof that comfort food doesn't have to make sense. It just has to make you full. Mock-fried chicken steak is a really interesting one because this actually makes use of so many things in creative ways to mimic the texture, taste, and overall feeling of fried chicken steak. Traditionally, the recipe calls for cheap cuts of meat, but in the Great Depression, people were even running with non-meat ingredients thanks to World War II rationing, which really put a massive hole in America's overall meat supply. In the 50s, too, home cooks brought this recipe back when they really needed to stretch a small amount of protein or use government food. So if you make this dish with ground meat or beef pork and shape it into a patty, mix it with breadcrumbs and cracker crumbs, and then douse it in seasoned flour or cracker crumbs again, then pan-fry it, you get a pretty decent imitation of chicken fried steak. You just have to be really careful with what kind of seasonings you use because it's also true that the kind of seasoning you go with decides how good of an imitation of a chicken fried steak this is. The most interesting part is probably the flour-based version, which was straight out of the Depression. People would make a fritter using flour, milk, and eggs to make something that resembled a steak, and this was seasoned and fried. There was no meat, but it was meant to imitate the breading, flour-y taste of the meal anyway. In all cases, it was a comfort meat, and a chunk of that comfort was that it kept your wallet in good health. Bread scramble is pretty much one of those moments of sheer creativity, resourcefulness, and making the most out of things that just would never go together if you were adhering to common sense. It's a throw-together breakfast if I've ever seen one. I mean, you would honestly be hard-pressed to not call this survivalist cooking. It's exactly what you might think it is, too. Torn up pieces of bread that's either a day old at best or several at worst tossed up into a hot skillet. Add some butter and bacon grease, then scramble it up to high heaven with some eggs. People would typically add whatever scraps they could to make the meal stand out a bit more. They'd add leftover ham, onions, and different kinds of herbs, and flavor-wise, just think of it like a bread-based omelet. It actually soaks up a lot of the eggs and fat, so it's definitely a lot more flavorful than you would expect, and it gets the job done well enough from what is essentially a very impromptu breakfast. Probably end up with a nasty case of heartburn if you use this recipe regularly, though. Sometimes a quick and simple solution was needed when the month's budget was running low. Enter the cold hot dog slices and ketchup sandwich. This sandwich was made with leftover hot dogs, sliced cold, and slathered with ketchup between slices of bread. It wasn't fancy, but it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. After payday, people might have splurged on hot dogs, but by the end of the week, those leftovers would be repurposed into this quick fix. The cold hot dog slices were nothing more than a vehicle for the ketchup, but when combined with bread, it made a satisfying snack or lunch. There wasn't much finesse to it, but it worked. It might not win any culinary awards, but when you've got limited resources, you make do with what you have. And while this sandwich may seem like an odd pairing, it's definitely one you'd want to try if you're in need of a last-minute meal. However, if you're craving something a little heartier, the next sandwich might just be what you're looking for. Canned potato salad was a quick and inexpensive side dish that used canned potatoes combined with budget-friendly dressings like mayonnaise and vinegar to create a satisfying accompaniment for meals. This dish was especially handy in the 1970s when fresh potatoes might not be affordable or readily available for every meal. Using canned potatoes saved time and effort, while simple seasonings and onions added flavor without extra cost. Potato salad was often served cold, making it ideal for potlucks, picnics, or just a refreshing counterpoint to heavier main dishes. Its creamy texture and tangy taste made it a crowd pleaser among families seeking comfort food that did not strain their wallets. This recipe demonstrated how pantry staples could be turned into tasty sides with minimal ingredients and preparation, fitting perfectly into the thrifty lifestyle many households practiced during the decade. Water pie was the desperate dessert that turned almost nothing into something sweet enough for Christmas dinner. When families could not afford eggs, milk, butter, or fruit, this pie emerged from sheer necessity and stubborn determination to have dessert on the holiday table. The filling was astonishingly simple: water, sugar, flour, vanilla, and small amount of butter mixed together and poured into a pie crust. During baking, the mixture transformed into custard-like filling that was surprisingly satisfying. The pie had other names in different regions: depression pie, desperation pie, names carrying the weight of era's hardship. Children eating this pie often never knew how little it contained, only that mother had made them Christmas dessert. The crust could be made from lard and flour, ingredients even the poorest pantries usually held. Water pie represented the absolute bottom of Depression experience, yet also represented triumph, love and determination, creating celebration from virtually nothing at all. Instant coffee meat rub was one of those oddball ideas that somehow worked. You'd mix instant coffee crystals with sugar, salt, and a pinch of flour, rub it on cheap cuts of meat, and throw it in the oven or pan. The coffee acted like a smoky glaze, turning the outside dark and caramelized while hiding the fact that the meat was tough as rubber. It was a poor man's barbecue, full of flavor and pride. Families used it for pork, chicken, or whatever protein happened to be on sale. The smell filled the house like something from a steakhouse, and everyone gathered around pretending it was a special occasion. Even if the meat was chewy, no one complained. The magic of that bittersweet crust fooled everyone into believing it was better than it was. It was one of those small miracles from a time when making dinner meant making do. Cornmeal was the magic dust of poor households, cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly useful. A single sack could turn into mush for breakfast, hoe cakes for lunch, and cornbread for dinner. Farmers used it, miners used it, families swore by it. Cornmeal was filling, nutritious, and worked with just about any leftover you had lying around. It was the one ingredient that could carry you through a whole week of hunger without complaint. People used it with lard drippings to make golden cakes crisp on the edges and soft in the middle. For others, it meant a pot of warm corn mush, sweetened with molasses or salted for a savory twist. Kids grew up on it, and mothers stretched it with water when milk was gone. When the pantry looked bare, cornmeal never disappointed. It was the friend that always stayed. Its grainy texture and rich smell of roasting corn were the scent of home for millions. Even today, there's something grounding about a skillet of cornbread, reminding us how far thrift and a bit of grit could take a person. Eggshell bone broth stew was the kind of dish whispered about, not for flavor, but for what it represented. Eggshells were rinsed, dried, and dropped into a pot of bones and water, not for taste, but for calcium. The shells would dissolve over time, thickening the broth and leaving behind a faint, chalky depth. Into this went carrot tops, celery leaves, onion skins, every forgotten part of everything. It simmered for hours, sometimes days. What came out was not stew in the restaurant sense, but it was nourishment. It was science turned into folklore. Mothers swore it made children strong. Grandfathers claimed it cured colds. And maybe it did. Maybe the power was not in the minerals, but in the belief that something invisible was still at work. Eggshell bone broth stew was humble, quiet, and a little strange. But in a world where pennies were precious, it meant you could still offer warmth. Ketchup sandwiches may sound like a joke today, but in the Depression era, they were a quick meal for children and adults alike. With meat out of reach for many, a slice of bread spread thin with ketchup became lunch or even dinner. The tangy, sweet flavor gave the illusion of something more filling, especially when paired with a second slice of bread. Sometimes butter or margarine was added if available, but most of the time it was just bread and ketchup. While humble, it provided calories when little else was around, and children often looked forward to it simply because it tasted different from the usual plain bread. It was also portable, making it an easy option for workers or school lunches. Though it might not sound appetizing now, it kept hunger away for countless families. For many who grew up in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches became an unforgettable part of their childhood survival. Spam and eggs were the emergency dinner that never felt like one. Spam was the meat that came in a tiny rectangular can, and once you heard that suction sound as it slid out, you knew what was coming. You sliced it thick or thin, fried it in a pan until it crisped at the edges, and served it alongside scrambled eggs that may or may not have come from a powder. It was salty, greasy, and surprisingly good, if you grew up eating it, that is. Some people looked down on Spam, but when money was tight, Spam was a lifesaver. It had a long shelf life, required no refrigeration, and could be stretched across several meals. It showed up in casseroles, sandwiches, and stews, But next to eggs, it felt like breakfast for dinner, which somehow made everything okay. You would douse it in ketchup or hot sauce, whatever you had, and you would eat it at a small table with mismatched chairs and flickering lights and think, this could be worse, and it often was. Boiled fruitcake was the Christmas dessert that required no oven, a practical solution for families whose wood supply couldn't spare fuel for baking. The batter combined flour, sweet, molasses, dried fruit, and spices into a dense mixture wrapped tightly in cheesecloth and lowered into boiling water. Hours of simmering produced a dark, moist cake even denser than its baked cousin. Steam cooking preserved every bit of moisture, creating texture almost sticky with sweetness. Families without proper ovens could still produce Christmas cake using nothing but a large pot and patience. The boiled fruit cake improved with age, wrapped in cloth soaked with brandy or cider if available, or stored in cool cellars where it kept for weeks. Sliced thin and served with coffee, it provided sweetness lasting through the entire holiday season. This forgotten method proved celebration didn't require fancy equipment, just knowledge passed down from generations who understood how to create abundance from almost nothing. Potato cakes from leftover mash might not sound exciting, but they were a lifeline for families trying to stretch every bit of food they had. Leftover mashed potatoes never went to waste, and these fried patties were living proof. You mixed the cold mashed potatoes with flour or breadcrumbs, sometimes an egg if you were lucky, and fried them in a hot skillet until they were golden brown and crispy on the outside. It turned yesterday's leftovers into today's breakfast or dinner side. Potato cakes filled plates when grocery money ran low and the pantry looked empty. They popped up in all those frayed, oil-stained cookbooks because they made sense. They stretched food, cost nearly nothing, and fed everyone without complaint. You could dress them up with chopped onions, bits of herbs, or a dollop of sour cream if you had it, but most folks just ate them plain with salt and pepper. It might not be fancy, but these simple cakes brought a little warmth, crunch, and comfort to the dinner table when options were slim. If nothing else, they proved that waste was never an option back then. Peanut butter stuffed celery was a party plate staple and a lunchbox treat in lean times. It was cheap, cheerful, and deceptively filling. Stalks of celery were washed, trimmed, and filled with a thick layer of peanut butter, sometimes smooth, sometimes crunchy, depending on what was on hand. If there was a little more room in the grocery budget, raisins were pressed on top, turning them into what children called ants on a log. But even without the extras, it worked. The crunch of the celery, the richness of the peanut butter, the contrast of cold and creamy, it hit all the right notes for a simple snack. It required no cooking, no prep, and no waste. Celery was cheap. Peanut butter could last weeks. For those who grew up on it, peanut butter stuffed celery was more than a snack. It was proof that a little could go a long way. Canned Vienna sausage stew was the 1980s answer to dinner when the paycheck ran dry, but you still needed to feed everyone. Pop open a can of Vienna sausages, slice them up, and throw them into a pot with instant potatoes and green beans from another can. Let it all simmer in broth until the flavors came together, and you had a meal that felt bigger than it was. The sausages were soft, salty, and oily enough to add richness to the pot. It was a one-dish dinner that didn't need measuring cups or fresh anything. Moms across America called it pantry stew, and it filled houses with that familiar smell of survival and ingenuity. You'd eat it with white bread to soak up the gravy, and for a few minutes, everyone forgot how tight money was. It was a recipe that belonged to those who refused to go hungry, even if all they had was a can and a stove. Some of the best things in life came from improv, and hobo stew is pretty much the exact same. Hobo stew is pretty much a dish that was made out of sheer necessity. It doesn't have a set-in-stone recipe or any strict guidelines to follow. With this recipe, all you really need to do is essentially just take whatever vegetables and meat scraps you have, or just whatever you have in your pantry, and keep it in one pot. This essentially stews, and the end result is usually a complete wild card. Not only is this a good way to make use of everything in your house, ensuring nothing goes to waste, but it's also a pretty handy way of checking out your cooking skills. A lot of the reason dishes like these were even good in the first place is because people had an intuitive understanding of what flavors would work, how much of something to add, how long to let something stay on the stove, and that's just something you develop from trial and error, so get to experimenting instead of ordering. Lard biscuits are pretty much the heroes of old-school baking. If you actually look at it from a historical lens, these unapologetically flavorful biscuits have kept way more bellies full than something like turnips. No, but really, lard biscuits have been a generational safety net for when a hunger pang is about to turn a bad day into a bad week. Lard biscuits were the go-to in Southern kitchens for the longest time, even before butter became a staple ingredient in the area. Folks would keep tins of drippings on the stove, but most of the lard was preserved, not because people had to ration it or because they were running awfully short, but because they just liked it that much. Lard biscuits are something you don't see around anymore, but during several of the past few centuries, as well as notable periods like the Great Depression and the World Wars, lard biscuits were man's best friends. When the budget was tight and even jam or jelly was out of reach, butter and sugar sandwiches came to the rescue. It was as simple as it sounds: a thick layer of butter spread on white bread, then topped with a generous sprinkle of sugar. For many, this became the go-to treat, especially during the Depression. It was sweet, satisfying, and didn't require much in terms of ingredients. The butter added richness, and the sugar gave it a touch of sweetness, making it feel like a real dessert, even if it was just a way to fill the stomach when times were tough. The best part? It was incredibly cheap to make, and you didn't have to go hunting for expensive ingredients. Families would often have this as a snack or even as a light dessert to end the day. Despite how simple it seems, there's something comforting about its humble sweetness. But as simple as butter and sugar may be, it's about to get even simpler with the next sandwich on our list. Peanut butter and oat bars were a homemade, no-fuss snack that combined simple pantry ingredients like rolled oats and peanut butter into a filling and affordable treat. These bars were perfect for busy families and kids needing something to keep hunger at bay between meals without costing a fortune. Mixing just a few ingredients into a pan, then baking or chilling them into bars, made for an easy and portable snack. Peanut butter provided a rich, satisfying flavor and a good dose of protein, while oats added chewiness and fiber. Sweeteners like honey or sugar could be adjusted according to taste and budget, making this recipe highly customizable. During the 1970s, when packaged snacks were not always affordable or accessible, these bars offered a wholesome alternative that lasted well and could be made in large batches to feed many. They were great for school lunches, picnics, or a quick energy boost after work. Peanut butter and oat bars combined simplicity and nutrition, showcasing the era's practical approach to homemade foods. Potato soup became the warm embrace that greeted many families on Christmas morning when nothing else filled the pantry. Potatoes cost only pennies per pound even in the hardest years and could be stored in root cellars for months without spoiling. Mothers would dice whatever potatoes remained from fall harvest, simmering them slowly with onions in water or milk until the mixture thickened naturally into creamy filling soup. The aroma of simmering onions and tender potatoes filled small kitchens, creating warmth that went beyond temperature. Some families added bacon grease for richness, while others stretched the soup by crumbling day-old bread into each bowl. Children gathered around tables covered with oilcloth, hands wrapped around warm bowls that chased away December chill. Potato soup required no expensive ingredients, no special equipment, just patience and willingness to turn humble vegetables into something that tasted like love. It was Christmas dinner for those who had nothing else to serve. Cane syrup ginger cookies were the winter sweets born from necessity, shaped by families who could not afford refined sugar but still wanted something warm and comforting. Cane syrup was cheaper, accessible, and kept well through the cold months, making it a trusted companion in countless kitchens. Grandma mixed it with flour, fat, and ground ginger, creating a soft dough that smelled like holiday spice even on ordinary afternoons. When the cookies baked, they spread into soft, chewy circles with edges that crisped just enough to snap gently under your teeth. The flavor was deep, warm, and earthy, the kind of sweetness that lingered rather than shouted. Families cherished these cookies because they brought joy without requiring ingredients that winter budgets could not handle. They tasted like generosity in lean times, a reminder that sweetness did not need to be extravagant to matter. Cane syrup ginger cookies were humble but powerful, a dessert that made cold days feel kinder. Dried apples or peaches were the candy of the poor. When fruit season ended and the trees went bare, families turned to their stored slices for sweetness. They were carefully strung on twine or dried on tin roofs under the sun until leathery but fragrant, then tucked away in jars for the winter. Come cold months, those shriveled bits were magic, rehydrated in stews, baked into pies, or stirred into oatmeal for breakfast. The smell of simmering dried peaches could fill a house with nostalgia, a memory of better days when fruit was fresh and full. These humble little treasures reminded families that sweetness didn't always come from luxury. It came from effort, from patience, from knowing how to make things last. Kids looked forward to dried fruit desserts like city children waited for candy. They were proof that joy could be saved in a jar, waiting quietly until you needed it most. Housewives knew every slice mattered, saving even bruised fruit to dry so nothing was wasted. That soft sweetness in a pie or porridge reminded everyone that even in the leanest winters, the taste of summer could still find its way home. Sawdust dumpling stew did not have real sawdust, but you might have thought it did. It started with stale bread, so dry it crumbled like wood, and was shredded into dust, soaked in water, and mashed into a heavy paste. That paste got pinched into lumps, dropped into a weak broth made from bones or salted water, and boiled until swollen. The dumplings held their shape, barely. They were gray, dense, and heavy as stones. But they gave the illusion of a full pot. A single onion or garlic clove made it sing. Some added a splash of vinegar, others a pat of lard. But the dumplings were the point. They made you chew, they made you full, and they reminded you that bread, even at the end of its life, still had one more job to do. It was not elegant, but it was enough. And in kitchens where the wind blew through the cracks in the wall, that mattered more than taste. Pot liquor with cornbread was a Southern tradition that became a Depression-era favorite because it stretched nothing into something filling. Pot liquor was the nutrient-rich broth left over after boiling greens like collards, turnip tops, or mustard greens. Instead of throwing it away, families would crumble cornbread into the liquid and eat it like a soup. It was packed with vitamins and minerals, even if it cost almost nothing to make. For poor families, it was a way to turn scraps into a full meal. It also carried a sense of comfort, with the familiar flavors of the greens and the cornbread blending together into something that felt substantial. Often it was eaten for dinner when nothing else was left in the pantry, but it still provided strength and nourishment. Many remembered it fondly as both survival food and comfort food, proving that even the simplest things could be cherished. Fried bologna sandwiches were the poor kid's steak. You slapped that bologna in a hot pan until it curled like a rose petal, then threw it on white bread with a smear of mustard. If you were lucky, a slice of cheese made an appearance. If not, the bologna had to carry all the weight. It sizzled, popped, and released that smell, salty, greasy, unmistakable. There was always that little charred ring around the edge, a perfect halo of survival. This was not deli meat. This was the cheapest pack in the fridge. It came in a big plastic tube, sealed with a twist tie or worse, and you knew it was going to last all week. You did not toast the bread. You barely buttered the pan. The goal was simple: get it hot and slap it together. Sometimes there was ketchup, sometimes a pickle slice. But most times it was just the basics, a sandwich that told you exactly where you stood. You sat on the floor or leaned over the sink while you ate it, grease dripping down your hand, and never questioned why this was a staple. Because it worked, and because it was yours. Oxtail soup was the Christmas Eve tradition that turned the cheapest cut at the butcher shop into liquid gold simmered with patience and care. Oxtails, bony, cartilage-rich tails that most customers overlooked, were browned until deeply caramelized, then covered with water and simmered for hours with onions, carrots, turnips, and whatever root vegetables the seller provided. As collagen broke down, the broth became silky and rich, the meat falling from bones into tender shreds that dissolved on the tongue. The soup required time rather than money, making it perfect for families where labor was plentiful, but cash was scarce. A single pot could feed 8 or 10 people, stretched further with potatoes or barley. Served in deep bowls with thick bread for sopping, oxtail soup warmed bodies and spirits on the coldest night of the year. Though oxtails now appear on upscale menus, they once belonged to the poor, proof that the best flavors often come from what others discard. Dandelion green salad with bacon drippings was the definition of making the most out of what nature handed you, and doing it with style. When grocery budgets dried up and gardens had not yet filled in, folks turned to the wild patches of dandelions sprouting up around their homes. Those greens were packed with vitamins and free, which made them priceless in tough times. You foraged the leaves, gave them a good wash, and tossed them with hot bacon drippings for flavor. Sometimes you added a sprinkle of vinegar or chopped onions, but even plain, it was a meal that kept folks fed when options ran thin. This salad was scribbled down in those old community cookbooks and passed along like gold by families who knew the value of stretching every scrap. It was not fancy, but it brought a bite of freshness to plates often filled with starches and leftovers. Dandelion salad reminded folks that survival did not always come from the store. Sometimes it sprouted right outside your front door. Crisco toast was the kind of breakfast you made when payday was still a few sleeps away and you were down to the last loaf of bread. You would take a knife, scoop out a chunk of white shortening, and spread it over a slice of bread like it was the finest butter in the world. Sometimes, if you wanted to treat yourself, you would sprinkle sugar for sweetness or salt for that perfect bite of grease and crunch. The heat from the toaster would melt the Crisco into the bread, giving it that familiar shimmer that made it look richer than it was. Families made it before heading off to work or school, and no one ever complained because it was warm, filling, and reliable. There was something oddly comforting about it too. The simplicity, the smell, and the reminder that you could still make something from nothing. Crisco toast was proof that even when the cupboards were bare, you could still sit down to something that felt like breakfast, even if it was just illusion wrapped in nostalgia. We've talked a lot about butcher shops and what kind of cuts of meat they would usually throw away. So one of those was the liver, and one of the best ways to use it was to make a liver loaf out of it. People would genuinely do this. It would help a lot because livers were believed to not only be very dense in their protein content, but also really good for building blood and increasing your overall bone health. Livers were something that a lot of people back then were accustomed to eating as well, even though the metallic and iron-rich taste doesn't perform too well in today's climate. I mean, we have liver fans, but I'm just not sure how many of them would sustainably eat it every week. Either way, liver loaf was something that was more loaf and less liver, because even if the meat was one of the cheapest livers you could find, it still did need to be stretched out badly. It was good to have this with bread to make it more palatable, though. Vinegar pie for breakfast is something that really just doesn't even sound like a real meal. It honestly sounds like some kind of prank, but no. This is a very real dish, and it actually works in more ways than one. For starters, this doesn't really taste the way you think it would. I know you're imagining some really bitter, acidic notes from the vinegar, but the initial flavor beats are sweet tart, and they give off a very custardy vibe. It's a bit like a lemon chess pie, but just made with your typical pantry staples instead this time. The vinegar is the star of the show, as it should be, and it cuts through almost every other flavor present in the pie, but not to the point where you would think all you can taste here is just vinegar. It's rich. It has this tangy brightness that actually is very stimulating for your taste buds, and if you pair it up with some hot coffee, then it works as well as Bruno Mars does with Anderson .Paak. Vinegar pie is something that strangely, despite being a pretty innovative and flavorful hit, is something that would be called a desperation pie because it's something that was made mostly by the women of the South and the Midwest living in rural populations. In the summer, when tomatoes were in season and fresh produce was at its peak, tomato and sugar sandwiches became a beloved choice. Thick slices of juicy, ripe tomatoes, sprinkled with sugar, were placed between slices of bread. It might sound odd, but the sweetness of the sugar balanced the tang of the tomatoes, making it an unexpectedly delicious combo. Some people even added a little mayonnaise to the mix for extra creaminess. This sandwich became a perfect treat, often eaten barefoot on the porch in the warmth of summer. It was simple and sweet, a perfect way to enjoy the bounty of the season without spending much. While it was certainly a summertime favorite, this combo is one of those meals that people today may never quite understand. But if you think this sweet and savory duo is odd, the next sandwich is even more unconventional. Sloppy lentil sliders were a clever way to enjoy the sloppy Joe craze on a budget, swapping ground beef for lentils simmered in tangy tomato sauce. These mini patties were packed with flavor and nutrients, but cost a fraction of traditional meat sliders, making them a popular choice for families tightening their belts. Lentils provided a meaty texture that held together well when formed into small slider-sized patties, which were then topped with the signature sloppy Joe sauce. Served on small buns or even plain bread, these sliders brought joy to dinner tables without denting wallets. This dish embodied the spirit of 1970s thriftiness, taking a beloved classic and making it accessible to all income levels. The warm, tangy sauce paired perfectly with the hearty lentils, satisfying appetites and stretching meals further. It was a great way to introduce plant-based proteins before such ideas became mainstream, showcasing the timeless nature of creative, budget-friendly cooking. Prune cake brought dense, moist sweetness to Christmas tables when other fruits were too expensive. Dried prunes were affordable, shelf-stable, and available year-round at general stores, making them reliable for families who could not afford fresh fruit or canned goods. The batter was enriched with stewed prunes chopped and folded throughout, along with spices like cinnamon, allspice, and nutmeg that transformed simple ingredients into something festive. Baked in cast-iron pans, the cake emerged dark, fragrant, and moist in ways other Depression-era cakes rarely achieved. The prunes kept it from drying out, allowing it to be made ahead for Christmas Day. Some families added powdered sugar dustings while others served slices plain, letting fruit and spices speak for themselves. Prune cake was practical rather than glamorous, but it delivered real satisfaction to families who had learned that survival and celebration could coexist, each slice proving modest ingredients could still create holiday memories. Molasses snow biscuits were the winter morning treat families depended on when cold wind rattled the windows and sugar was too expensive to use freely. Molasses poured slow like winter honey, thick and dark, stretching sweet flavor through dough that otherwise would have tasted plain. Grandma mixed flour, baking powder, lard, and just enough molasses to tint the dough the color of early morning shadows. She shaped them quickly, hands practiced, and placed them close together so they rose against one another like a small family huddled for warmth. When they baked, the kitchen filled with the deep scent of molasses that made the whole house feel less cold. These biscuits were soft inside, with a slight crust outside, the perfect thing to tear open and eat with butter if you had it or plain if you did not. They were born from practicality but tasted like comfort, proof that even the simplest ingredients could become something worth remembering. On winter mornings when the world outside felt frozen, these biscuits made the first hour of the day feel hopeful. They were not fancy, but they were dependable, and that meant everything. Molasses snow biscuits were the kind of food that stayed in families even when circumstances changed, whispered from one kitchen to another, because no cookbook ever bothered to capture their worth. Flour barrels were the throne of every kitchen, the one thing no home could function without. A big barrel of flour in the corner meant security. It meant bread, dumplings, biscuits, and gravies for days. Poor men guarded their flour like treasure because one scoop could mean breakfast for the family. When you opened the lid and saw a fine white cloud rise, it felt like hope itself. Housewives made biscuits on wooden boards, cutting circles with cups when they had no proper tools. Dumplings floated in broth like little clouds, thickening soups that could stretch another night. Flour was also the base for gravy, that golden miracle that turned scraps into feasts. The smell of hot flour and fat cooking together was as close as you got to luxury on a poor man's plate. It was simple, practical, and pure, proof that even the most basic things can hold a kind of sacred power when times are hard. The barrel stood as a silent promise that tomorrow's meal was already halfway there. Wilted lettuce stew was never on a menu, but it was always in the garden, just past its prime. Lettuce that had turned soft, spotted or floppy, got chopped and thrown into a hot pan of bacon grease before it could rot completely. Add onions. Stir until everything surrendered. Then came the water, a splash of vinegar, and sometimes a bit of flour to make it cling to the spoon. It was more of a stew by mood than by definition. The leaves melted into the broth, green turning brown, flavors turning sharp and smoky. This was a dish built by desperation and rescued by memory. Your grandmother probably called it summer soup or garden stew to dress it up. But everyone knew it was wilted, it was what was left. And still, somehow, it was comforting. There is something quietly heroic about taking what the world says is garbage and turning it into dinner. Lettuce stew was not proud, but it was honest, and in that honesty lived a kind of strange, stubborn beauty. Potato rarebit was one of the Depression's clever ways to make potatoes feel more special than they were. The base idea was to take mashed or sliced potatoes and top them with a thin sauce of cheese, milk, and spices. Cheese was often scarce, so the sauce was made with very small amounts stretched as far as possible, sometimes even flavored with mustard to give it more punch. The result was a dish that felt rich and indulgent, even though it used little more than potatoes and scraps of cheese. Families would bake or broil it to give the top a golden crust, making it even more appealing. It was filling, cheap, and versatile, perfect for serving a large family. Children especially loved when potatoes got transformed this way, since it was a rare chance to enjoy something creamy and flavorful. Potato rarebit may not be common today, but it was beloved back then. Goulash was not Hungarian, not the kind we grew up with. This was American goulash, elbow macaroni, ground beef, and a tomato sauce that always tasted a little like metal. It was a one-pot meal, no rules, just a way to take cheap ingredients and turn them into something that could feed a small army. Some families used onions, others added garlic if they had it. But at its core, it was just meat, pasta, and sauce. And it was enough. You could scoop it out in huge portions and still have leftovers. It reheated well. It was easy to make. And most importantly, it was cheap. Goulash was the dinner you made when you could not afford variety. It was everything in one dish, and it worked. You knew it was going to be a goulash night when the cupboards were getting low and the mood in the house was just a little more tired, but somehow that big pot of steaming pasta made things feel okay. For one night, at least. Mock turkey was the centerpiece of Christmas tables where real poultry remained beyond reach, a testament to ingenuity born from necessity. Families took cheaper cuts of pork shoulder or veal, seasoned them heavily with sage, thyme, and onion, then shaped the meat into a rough bird form before roasting slowly in wood-fired ovens. The drippings became rich gravy that masked any difference from the real thing. Some households created elaborate molds from bread stuffing packed around the meat to mimic drumsticks and wings. Children rarely knew the difference. The mock turkey tradition stretched back to the Depression when a real bird could cost a full week's wages. By shaping humble ingredients with care, mothers transformed scarcity into celebration. The meal represented more than food. It was proof that love and creativity could make Christmas feel complete even when money couldn't. Today, mock turkey has vanished, but it once carried the weight of family pride. Honestly, the fact that nobody is talking about how good molasses toast is these days is certifiably criminal behavior. I just want you to picture hot toast, and I mean real, genuine bread, not packaged, factory-made fluff, but actual freshly baked bread with deep, dark molasses. Not the generic stuff you find in marts and stores nowadays, but actual molasses. Blackstrap, bitter, smoky, sweet, and punchy. This is something brown sugar wishes it could be. Molasses toast is something that was definitely the moment back when it was popular, and those were times when you would consider sugar a luxury. Most folks tried to get it on everything they possibly could, whether that was biscuits, cornbread, hot milk, pies, or toast. The first person to put that stuff on toast hit a gold mine, and everybody copied the blueprint afterwards. The toast was absolutely the move, and butter melting with the molasses created this perfect harmony of sweetness. The bread was the perfect stage for that, and if you had it today, you'd feel like you're going back through time to a farmhouse kitchen in the 40s. You can eat this toast as it is or mix it up with some honey and nuts if you really feel like bringing out your inner chef. Some people also double down on the sugar rush by adding cinnamon and vanilla extract. Egg foo young in the Americanized style was a go-to meal for families looking for a quick and hearty dish without breaking the budget. This simple egg omelet is packed with whatever vegetables you had on hand, like bean sprouts, onions, and peas, all fried together and smothered in a savory brown sauce made from pantry staples. Unlike the traditional Chinese version, this recipe uses a more approachable flavor profile for American palates, making it a nostalgic reminder of 1970s takeout nights. It stretched a few eggs into a meal that felt like a treat and was easy enough to whip up on any weeknight. Plus, it made leftovers taste like new again the next day, proving that clever cooking was the real secret to surviving tight budgets. Whether it was served with rice or alone, egg foo young was a simple way to bring something a little different to the dinner table without spending much. The mix of fluffy eggs and crisp veggies gave families a comforting, filling dish that was perfect for when money was tight, but taste still mattered. Tomato soup with grilled cheese was the rainy day classic that never failed to make kids feel warm from the inside out. The moment a storm cloud rolled in, kids would start hoping their mothers would make this exact combo because nothing else matched the feeling of dipping a buttery sandwich into a bowl of steaming soup. The soup usually came straight from a can, cheap and dependable, mixed with water or milk to make it smoother. As it heated, the rich tomato smell filled the room, promising comfort before you even took the first bite. Meanwhile, the grilled cheese sizzled in a pan, the bread crisping in butter until it turned that perfect shade of golden brown. When the cheese melted completely, stretching in strings when you pulled the sandwich apart, you knew dinner was going to be perfect. Kids could barely wait for the soup to cool down before dipping the sandwich into it, soaking up all that warmth and flavor in one bite. It was simple, cheap, and so easy that mothers could make it even on their most exhausted days. But it never felt tired or ordinary. It felt like kindness in a bowl. It tasted like being taken care of. Kids begged for this meal because it felt like a warm hug, the food equivalent of being wrapped in a blanket while the world outside stayed cold and gray. It was childhood comfort at its absolute best. Dried pinto beans were the real muscle behind every hard-time meal. They were humble, sure, but they were also one of the most important foods ever stocked in American pantries. Poor men relied on them because they were cheap, filling, and versatile enough to become anything, from stews to soups to spreads. You could buy a big sack of dried beans for a few cents, soak them overnight, and stretch one pot into several days' worth of dinners. When meat disappeared from the table, beans stepped up. Mothers would season them with salt pork or just a spoonful of lard, maybe toss in an onion if they had one. The result was hearty and comforting, proof that flavor could be coaxed out of almost nothing. Beans didn't just feed stomachs, they fed communities. Churches, farms, and neighbors shared sacks during bad winters, knowing that beans meant everyone would eat. The smell of a bean pot simmering on the stove was a signal of warmth, of life continuing even when money was tight. They were the kind of food that asked for patience but gave back comfort in return, a true testament to the art of surviving with grace. Potato peeling stew was the kind of dish born from a kitchen where nothing could be thrown away, not even the skins. It started with a pot of leftover broth, beef if you had it, salted water if you did not. Into that went the peels of every potato, not scrubbed clean but left with the grit of the day still on them. Onion ends followed, the ones too tough or bruised for frying, and if you were lucky, a garlic clove or carrot stub made its way in too. It simmered on the back burner all day, turning scraps into supper. The broth would thicken slightly, cloudy from starch and mystery. Salt was precious, pepper was a gift, and if someone added a splash of vinegar, you might mistake it for something special. They called it stew because soup sounded too thin, too hollow. It tasted like everything and nothing. But it filled bellies. Children never knew the difference. They just knew the smell meant someone tried. It was survival with a wooden spoon, and somehow it was enough. The stove knew. The person who taught you how to read it is gone, but the recipes aren't. Drop your favorite